So what we'll be looking at here now is version 7 of the NPR Tech News example or example project. In this, we'll be migrating the project to use a more modern architecture pattern. And namely, in that process, we'll be using ViewModel and we'll be using LiveData to separate the UI layer from the actual data, as well as separating from the data layer from the UI. So that's what we're going to be looking at. So the relevant reading materials, as we saw, we kind of reviewed most of these. Guide to application architecture, the model overview, the live data overview, and saving UI state. So that's the kind of relevant articles there. All right, I'm going to go ahead and open this project in Android Studio. So I need to close the project I already have open. Go over to open. Go over to version 7 of my project. I'm going to open that up. And I'm going to go ahead and tell that to run on my device. If it will go. There it goes. Okay. So you'll notice initially when the app runs, it should say feed missing. You'll notice it says connected because the internet's connected. If I hit refresh, it will go pull the data down. One thing to notice, it's different in this version. Remember how I said this helps with surviving configuration changes. In the previous version of this, if you turned it sideways, you would lose all that data. So if I turn it sideways now, you'll see that it preserves, it keeps all those stories that it's downloaded previously. It doesn't have to go back out to the server and download them again. So that's an important thing there, is it's preserving that data through a configuration change. Okay, that's one important part. Another thing you might notice here, if I try to go to airplane mode, boop, okay, so I'm now disconnected. We can see that works. If I hit refresh, we'll notice that there's an error appearing here. Network is disconnected. So previously I was showing the error messages down here, but to make this work, I had to actually add another additional text view to the layout to show errors. So there's also an error text view here as well. Okay, so that's one of the additions I had to make to the layout. All right, so let's start diving and looking through the code. So I'm going to start by looking at just main activity first, and we can see where some of this code might be different. And then I'm going to jump through and talk through the other classes, which is where the primary portion of this example is going to be. So if we look under main activity, we'll see that there's actually a lot less code. So for instance, you'll see all the stuff related to that connectivity manager is gone, right? There's nothing related to connectivity manager in main activity. Nothing related to that. Instead, what we're doing is we're observing the view model. So you can see here on line 51, I say get connected and then observe. So it's actually watching for changes to the connected state from the view model instead of doing all that registration, all that logic itself. So all that logic is actually somewhere else in terms of working with connectivity. You look further down, you can look kind of through what is here and such, and you'll find also things that aren't here. That thread, that async task is completely gone, right? So there's no thread, there's none of the retrofit code. No HTTP URL connection, no streams, no readers, none of that code is here in the activity, right? So all the stuff that's in the activity is just concerned strictly with how do I render the UI, right? So how do I show the user that it's connected or disconnected? How do I show error messages? How do I show toast messages or snack bars? How do I show and format the feed? If we got a new feed, how do I output that to the screen? So that's all the code that's here. The only code that's in the activity now is strictly presentation logic. Okay. So that's one thing to recognize there, and that signals that this is, as I said, a very big change. It's a very big change and shift in understanding, and a big shift in thinking about how we architect things. Okay, so where I'm going to go to next is I'm going to go next to where the crux of our application is now. So rather than the crux of the application, the main part of the application being in the activity anymore, we really start with the view model and work from there. Okay, so if I look at under the code here, you'll see that I've made some additional folders. So I've got a UI package and I've got a data package. Okay, so UI is where my UI layer is, and data is where my data layer is. In fact, actually, main activity should technically be considered. Main activity should be under the UI layer. I didn't move it because there are some issues that arise when you start to move activities around. So I just left it here. Plus, I figured that would keep the code easier to work with and easier to do, just because, again, moving main activity is a little bit more of a chore. Let's look at the model, right? So the model is kind of where the main logic of our application is. So we go over and look at the model. Okay, so the model, you can see, extends Android ViewModel. Okay, remember, your view models can extend. ViewModel is one option, but notice this one actually extends Android ViewModel as opposed to ViewModel. The reason it does that is because it actually needs access to a context, it needs access to the application, it needs to do a few things with the application, and so by making it an Android view model, I get access to the application, not just access to not just access to the activity. So I needed access to the application. So that's why that's there. I've got a tag, just like I've done with everything. So the log tag refers to the class that's in here. It's NPR news model. I then have a set of instance variables, one that are related to connectivity. And so the connectivities ones are around maintaining the status of is it connected or disconnected. I've got some other variables that are around the newsfeed, and so that's about pulling the newsfeed, determining if it's fetching or not. So remember, this button is disabled while it's doing the fetch. So if I don't know what happened there. If I go back to airplane mode, out of airplane mode, you'll see that that's briefly disabled while it's fetching. So that's part of the status. I also can potentially have an error message that comes back because something might go wrong, as well as the feed. So all of this is related to dealing with the news feed. Then I've also got a LiveData that's storing the Snackbar, the Snackbar message that appears as well. So that happens, say, when the feed is refreshed or if an error occurs, if your network is disconnected. But that's just a single string as far as the data that I need to store there. Okay, so those are some of the instance variables. Let's talk about the actual constructor. So the constructor for this class takes an application, and specifically it's taking NPR News app. I'll come back to that later, why it's actually pulling my subclass of application. So that's what we're using there. I'll again come back to that in a bit. Internally here, we're then asking for the connectivity manager. So app.getSystemService connectivity manager. So this is, you're kind of seeing the code that used to work with the connectivity manager has started to move over into this view model and the data sources. So first things first, I'm going to get that connectivity manager. I'm going to pass it down to this connectivity data source object that I have. So that data source is going to work with tracking whether or not the network is disconnected. And that's basically its job. Like, the data source is tracking whether or not it's connected. So it has a live data called connected, which I'm asking for and I'm saving. So this live data is coming for and really is owned by this data source. So that data source is what's actually tracking and dealing with the connected state. Okay, and so this will then have the listener, have the registration, have the callback. That's where that code's going to live to deal with it being connected or disconnected. That data source is going to manage that. The next thing I have for the news feed is I've got this news API class. So the news API class is the data source that I use for working with the news feed. And so you can start to see that I'm breaking up things based on where the data comes from. So there's a data source for connectivity. There's a data source for the news API. If I was working with the eBay one, I would have like this connectivity data source. I would have to manage connectivity. I would have the auth API to manage authentication, and I would also have the browse API to deal with browsing the catalog of things that are available in the store. So as things grow, you will have more and more of these data sources and associated live data objects to go with them. So all of these variables, notice here, they're all declared as mutable live data. This one is called live data because here we're just getting it from something else. Something else is actually creating and managing that live data, whereas here the model is actually managing those three live datas. So here they are mutable live datas. So I'm constructing them in the constructor here, creating three mutable live datas. When I create them, I need to say what is the initial value. So I'm saying initially it's not fetching, right? Initially the user hasn't initiated a fetch or a refresh. So initially this is false. Initially there's no error message, so that's null, and initially we don't have a feed, so that is null as well. So I'm initializing all of those live datas with their original or their starting values. I'm also creating the Snackbar live data, and so Snackbar live data starts as null because there's initially no message there, kind of like there's no error message initially. And then I'm finally doing a log just to help, so you can kind of, if you're looking at the console, you can kind of see how these steps go, what happens in what order they occur. So that's the setup, that's the constructor. So we create all of our data sources. So here I create my connectivity data source and I create my news data source. So I'm creating those two data sources and all the live datas, all the mutable live datas and such that I need in the constructor. Next thing you'll see in these view models is you'll have all of these getters. So there's a bunch of different getters for the different live datas that they're exposing. So you can have the connected state is exposed as a live data, which is a Boolean. Whether or not it's fetching is exposed as a Boolean, live data Boolean, so the front end can watch that as well. There's a string, there's a live data string, which is the error message. So you saw that was when the red message appeared. And then there's a live data for this news API.feed object. That's the response that comes back from the REST API, from that API endpoint. So we say, okay, let's send that back, make that available. And then there's also a live data for the actual Snackbar message that pops up. So for all of those live datas you'll be having when you're building out your view models, you'll have a bunch of getters there for the different pieces of state that you need. Cool. Questions on that so far? An important thing to note is that all of these return live data. None of them return mutable live data. That is a super, super important detail. All of your getters on your view model must return live data, not mutable live data. That's important in terms of encapsulation because we encapsulate the logic of this in the view model. Okay, so all right, next up. There are two methods in here. So one is refresh feed. Refresh feed is what gets called when the user clicks the refresh button. So when the user clicks the refresh button, let me walk back here. When the user clicks the refresh button, we call, here it is, model.refreshFeed. That's it, right? There's no additional logic in the activity anymore. The activity used to have a lot more in there, but all it has is say, hey, I'm going to call refresh feed. So if we look at what's happening in refresh feed, the first thing it does is it checks whether or not there's a connection. So we say, is connected equal to true? Now, the syntax here is a little bit weird. So notice I'm calling connected.getValue. Connected.getValue, connected, remember, is a live data. GetValue will give me the current value of that live data. Now, that live data is a Boolean, uppercase Boolean, not a lowercase Boolean. That's inherent in there because that's important in there because when we're dealing with generics, we can't actually put primitives as a generic argument. So this has to be a not a primitive type, but a reference type. So that's why I'm using the reference type Boolean instead of the primitive type Boolean. So that's where there's an uppercase B there. And so because of that, this is an object, and I can't just do equals equals. That would be comparing the reference instead of comparing value. So I need to do dot equals because I'm comparing those two things. And here I'm saying boolean.true, which is a constant on the Boolean class. And I'm comparing that with connected.getValue. Now, the order of that is important. The order of that is important because this means I'm calling on true, which is never null. True is never null. But I'm not guaranteed that connected.getValue won't return null. Connected.value might return null if that live data, for whatever reason, ends up being null or is initially null. So that's part of why I need to be doing it in that order to avoid a null pointer exception. If I flip those and I said connected.value equals Boolean true, then I could potentially get a null pointer exception because connected.value might be null. So the order there matters. So if it's not connected, we just go on down here. I'm getting the message, and the way I'm getting the message is I'm saying get application.getString and getting the error network disconnected. This is one of those reasons why I needed to use the Android ViewModel instead of the ViewModel, is to order how this application to be able to call getString on. So in here, we're sending back that network disconnected message. I'm setting fetching. You see I'm setting it to false. False saying that's not fetching now. I'm going to set the error message to that network disconnected. And we're going to send that as a Snackbar as well. And so if I go back and look, right, so we go into airplane mode and I hit refresh, that triggers this function, right? And so we can see that the button's not disabled. We can see the error message that appeared here, and we can also see the Snackbar that appeared up here. Okay, so let's, before I go into what's happening here in the connected case, let's look a little bit about this easy case, which is when we're disconnected from the network. So how does that all work, right? So let's go back to main activity. Okay, so in main activity, I got the model. We'll get into how I got that model in a second because you notice I'm getting it from the application. Once I've got the model, I say get connected dot observe, and I say, okay, let's observe it. When the connected changes, we're going to call show connected. Okay, so show connected calls this function, right? Pass in is connected. It based on whether or not connected is true or false. We both change the text as well as we change the icon. Okay. Difference here, notice that I'm not keeping is connected as a state variable. There's no local variable. There's no instance variable for that anymore. That's entirely the model's job to keep track of whether or not it's connected. So I'm just updating the UI when that changes. Similarly with fetching, I say get fetching.observe, and the refresh button is enabled as long as we're not fetching. Now notice the not in front of there. We're saying if it's enabled if it's not fetching. So it becomes true when we start the fetch, and that becomes false when we stop the fetch. So at both points the button just becomes enabled or disabled as the process starts. But it's backwards, right? It being enabled is the opposite of whether or not we're fetching. So that's where the not fits in. If there's an error message, we observe that, and we can see if I get an error message, I'm going to check if it's null. If it's not null, then the view is visible. Otherwise, if their error message is null, there's no error message to show, I'm going to go ahead and make that text view gone. It's going to disappear. And then I'm also going to set the text on that text view to whatever text we received, whether null or not. So that's that. As far as observing the feed, if anything happens with the feed, we call show feed to show the updated feed. Now, initially, when this application starts, the feed is null. So initially, this observer gets called, and it will go immediately in here and say, well, feed missing, because initially the feed is null. Okay, but once we get a new feed, later it's going to automatically update it when that feed comes in. Last up, the snackbar, we say snackbar.observe, and this one's a little bit interesting. This is kind of a trick to get the snackbar coming up, because I want the snackbar to just come up once and then not come up again. I want to only show that message once. So I am checking if the message is not null. As long as there is a message, then I'm going to do something. If there's no message to show, we don't need to do anything. So if there is a message to show, I say, okay, let's make that snackbar, attach it to or connect it to the refresh button to use it to figure out where to show it. Show the message that we ask for, show it for a short time, and show it. After I've shown it, I then call model.onSnackbarShown. Okay, so what am I doing there? Model.onSnackbarShown. Okay, well, that's this other function over here. So once we've shown the snackbar, I call this to post the value, set the snackbar back to null. That way the snackbar doesn't pop up again if something else or maybe some others observer or other things are going on. So we show it, we observe it, we show it, and then we actually set it back immediately to null so that snackbar doesn't get shown multiple times. So that's an important little trick in there in terms of making sure we're just showing the snackbar once. Okay. So you can start to see kind of the picture, right? So the view model doesn't directly access any of the views. It doesn't tell the views how to change. It just changes the data. But the activity doesn't know how the data changes. It just knows, okay, when the data changes, this is what I do, right? So they're both concerned with different things. This one's concerned with updating the UI based on the data, and the other one's concerned with updating the data and not worry about updating the UI. So different parts, right? And so that's all the code that we need here is just update the UI based on the data. So in this case, we update the data that way. If the network is connected, then we start by first things we want to do is we want to set fetching to true. That will disable the refresh button, so the user can't initiate another fetch, another refresh at the same time. So we disable the button first. Then I'm going to call into the news API. I'm going to call that get feed endpoint, and I'm going to say, let's go run that request asynchronously. Okay, and I provide a callback. Say, okay, let's go try to get the feed. We'll get it asynchronously. When it finishes, it's going to call one of these two callbacks. So if it's successful, it's going to call on response, at which point we'll show the message feed refreshed. We'll set the button to be enabled. So that's where I'm saying we're no longer fetching. Fetching is false. That's going to enable that button. I want to say, okay, there's no error message here. So if there previously was an error message, we need to clear it out. So we're setting it to null. And then I'm going to show the feed that we received as the body of that HTTP request. So here's the feed, the response that came back. And finally, show that snackbar. So the snackbar saying feed refreshed. So I just say, okay, update all the data this way when we get a successful response. If anything goes wrong, then instead we'll go over here and we'll say, okay, well, the message I'm going to show is the message from the exception. And I'm going to re-enable the button. I am going to show that error message both up here, and I'm also going to show that error message in the snackbar. So that's kind of the pathway there, and that's the code for the activities as well as the view model. Okay, that's really all that's there. Hopefully, and while this stuff is new, right? The view models and LiveData is a new concept. Hopefully, this code has been so far pretty easy to read. Hopefully so far this has been a really easy thing to understand, I hope. Any thoughts before I go and talk about the other two classes, the news API and the connectivity data source, those two data classes, data sources? Again, this is a big shift in how you think about working and building your applications. I will say that it's a big shift in that sense. On the other sense, it's really the whole point here is to make your code simpler. The whole point is make your code simpler. And this is also just a matter of getting you up to speed with a lot of things that are happening with modern application development. Okay, so last two classes we need to look at. Connectivity data source and news API. So let's look at connectivity data source first. Okay. So how are we doing this? Okay. So connectivity data source, you can see that it's got two member variables. One is a mutable live data, which is tracking the current connected status. Is it connected true or false? I've also got a reference to the connectivity manager. It's worth noting, you notice that both of these things are final because they can't be reassigned. The only time they're assigned is in the constructor. You'll see a similar thing back over in the ViewModel as well, where basically all of those are final, and that part is important. So in here, we're getting the connectivity manager as a constructor argument. So I'm taking that in, I'm going to save that to a variable, and connected is initially false. That's important, right? So initially, the connected status is set to false, okay? So initially, we're not connected. And then I'm going to go ahead, when this is constructed, I'm going to register a callback for the default network. So I'm listening for events or changes to the active network. And I'm registering this class itself as the callback. Now, that works because I've said that this class extends the network callback. So rather than using an anonymous class this time, I'm actually making this a subclass of the callback and registering myself. I've also got an unregister method. Should I need to unregister this data source, stop listening for events, I can call unregister to unregister my callback. Now, in this case, I'm not actually unregistering ever because the way I've built this out, I'm saying, hey, I want to hear network events for the entire time this application is alive. As long as this application is alive, I want to know about this. And so I don't actually, because I've not basically I've attached this to the application instead of attaching this to the activity. I don't actually need to unregister. I would need to definitely make sure that I unregister if I had attached this to an activity, but I'm not doing that. So next up, so let's look at, we've got a getter for the connected status. So you'll notice that this is returning a live data. Remember that all of these getters need to return live data, not mutable live data. Mutable live data should be encapsulated and kept inside of whatever class is using it. So here it's returning a live data, so that can be observed by the front end, whether or not it's connected. And then I have my different callbacks here. So when the network becomes available, I'm just doing a log message. If the capabilities change, which is when we find out if there's actual network connectivity and if it's been validated, I check that and then I post that updated value to that live data object. So we post a value saying, is it true or false? Is there internet connectivity or not? And then if we get the on loss callback, it's just posting false. So this is a really pretty simple data source. As is. There's not necessarily a whole lot going on here. The main thing is we're just registering a callback and using that callback then to post values to the live data, post changes to the live data, which can then be observed. Cool. So I'm effectively translating from this network callback space into the live data space. Next up, let's look at the news API. So the news API is encapsulating and working with retrofit to make that call, that HTTP call. So I've got instance variables. I got a retrofit instance. I've got this new service instance. So I create the retrofit instance that I've done before. My base URL is feeds.npr.org. I'm adding a converter factory for using JSON to convert my JSON data, and I'm constructing a service. Okay. To try and keep this simple, I've tried to keep all the classes for the news API under one class. So you'll notice that this has a few nested interfaces and classes and such. But all the data, all the stuff related to the news API is here. There is this one function here, which says, this is the one function that we use from the outside, is you say, hey, you want to get feed, so we call service.getFeed and just return the results from there. So that's how we initiate the refresh process. The service is actually defined here. We can see that it's a GET request, and the path is just 1019/feeds.json. So in order to make this full URL, remember it's take this part plus that part is the actual URL where the HTTP request will be made, is the combination of those two. So we call that's get feed, that returns a feed, and then we have 3 static classes down here to model the data that's returned. Those are the same classes that you saw yesterday, or just pushed into this news API class now as nested classes. And remember, the keyword static is to make them so that it's just the same as if they were out in external files. It's meaning that they don't have a reference to the news API object. So that's it. So really the part we do is we just say, hey, service get feed. That makes the request. We go back to our model. So we say service get feed. We then go and queue a request with that call. Good. And that's really all the code in this project right now. So should be manageable, should be workable. What you want to do is iterate and work on your project to incorporate some of this stuff. I would recommend starting with shifting things over to a ViewModel first, is where I would start, is implementing the ViewModel and then working through figuring out how to put your data sources in there, and then finally working your way back to main activity. One thing I didn't look at, I need to look at this NPR News app class. Okay, this is an interesting thing, and this wasn't in the reading material. Okay, oftentimes we need an application class that models data or holds data that's available throughout the entire application. So in this example, I'm keeping the NPR News model. The ViewModel is actually being owned by this application class. Okay, so it's got a private member variable for it. There's an onCreate for applications. This onCreate gets called when the actual application starts, versus the onCreate for an activity is not when the application starts, but when that activity is created, okay, which is actually later in the process. So this is when the application starts. We create the model, we pass in the application object that got in there, and then there's also a getter to get the model out of the application. Okay. One common gotcha, if you want to create a subclass of application, you do have to remember to register it up here in the manifest. So in the manifest, I said android.name is UI.news NPR News app. So that tells it to use my own custom subclass of application rather than using the normal application class. If I don't have that one line in here, then that whole application doesn't get, that app object doesn't get constructed, and several things in here don't work. So make sure that you're adding in, if you're following along this and trying to use an application, that's a common part that gets forgotten, is to add the Android name property in here. It just says, hey, use the class that I created, which is very similar to how this one works. So you'll notice on the activity, there's an Android name that says, hey, this is main activity. So it's the same kind of idea. It's just on the application instead of on the activity. Over in the main activity related to that, then the first two things I did is I said get application. And then because I've registered it in the manifest, I say, oh, okay, I'm going to downcast that to an NPR News app because that's my subclass. So I'm going to downcast to that, save that to this variable, and then from that app, I can then call getModel. I can call getModel to get the ViewModel because that's one of the methods that I've defined on the application class itself. That's down here. So then I can call that getter because I know I have that subclass. So that's one thing to mention there is I'm having the ViewModel actually owned by the application. And so there was some additional wiring that I had to do to make that happen. And I did mention in the code here that you have to remember to set the Android name in the manifest to make that work. Cool. Yes, I have recorded what we went over to today. I actually broke it up into 3 parts, so you'll see 3 recordings go up on YouTube for it.